Hello, everyone, and welcome to another season of American Scousers TV Fantasy Premier League Show. So it's myself and the Polish Prince dressed like a king.
Always.
Which, I mean,
like a prince, you know?
Kind of is like a prince, but maybe only the king would have that big a brooch on a show like this. But I give you a lot of credit. You went through a big off season. We all had big off seasons. No one had as big of an off season as you, my friend. You went from a solo artist to a married man. Congratulations.
Indeed I did. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was quite the whirlwind of a summer. Many emotions, many good emotions, I should say. But now, based on what she and I said in our vows, she understands this takes precedence. And football is life at the end of the day. And I'm happy that I'm with someone that can understand that. So here we are.
We've always said in our group that Michelle is a amazing human being. The fact that you were able to work in football is bigger than life into your vows, makes her maybe even more amazing than I knew. But we will get into our show. As always, I just want to thank everyone. We are back for another year here. We're going to be doing the Fantasy Premier League show each and every week, coming to you 9 Eastern, 8 Central, or whenever the Polish Prince shows up in his fine duds from work. We're going to start right about then. But we will be following our weekly Thursday night podcast that will be airing live as well. We really are hoping to get interaction this year, whether it be questions about transfers, strategy that we're talking about. So if you have questions, please feel free to ping them in the chat. If you ever want to, you can look us up on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram, and send us messages. Even send us screenshots of your team if you want us to critique it, or any kind of a update heading into next week, because obviously we only have one more week, and we will be when we produce our show next week and present this, we will be on the eve of the Premier League season coming back. And I don't know if that makes me like overly excited or a little nauseous, because it does mean that the next 9 months of my life will basically be dictated by about 4.5 hours a week of time spent between 7 and 11 in the morning on weekends, which only dictates how poor my weekends go.
Yeah. What's the joke is that I can't wait for my weekends to be dictated by 11 men running around the field with a ball. Yeah. That's at the point where we're at right now, guys.
It is. So where else we are at the point is the beginning of our American Scouser Cup 2.0, season number 2. Will you be able to take down the big winners? Will you be able to track folks down? Will we talk about you all season long being one of the best players of the overall game? Will either of us be able to get on the front page of the score sheet? All things probably no. But if you would like to play, you can either go directly to the Fantasy Premier League game, type in the code that you see on the screen, or you can go ahead and click the link right in the comments right now, and we will go ahead and make sure and get you in. Our first comment of the season comes in from our good friend, Kazi. What is the best tip for remembering your fantasy football? I'd say, Kazi, the best tip to remember fantasy football is you live and breathe with Liverpool Football Club every single week. Therefore, you know when they play. So if you can just remember when the first match of the entire game week is, and remember that you're actually playing the game, it's probably the first step. But for someone who only had about 5 head-to-head wins in our league last year, and I think 3 of them came against you, Kazi, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't remember that you're playing fantasy football, because at times last year, you were one of my favorite watches, because I think at one point he had 3 positive players like in his entire side that could get a point, and he found a way to win a match week with that because he had Mo captain. It's always great to see a Kazi team because it has the 3 best players in fantasy and then a bunch of guys who are no longer in the Premier League. not like our good friend Timuchin, who hosts the Monday night show, who actually strategizes around picking players from other leagues, which is why my team is being named this season the Bench Cancelos.
I saw that. I saw that. I thought that was a nice little homage to our fearless leader himself.
There was something there. We had to have it, but we do thank David for chiming in this early in this episode. And if he has any more questions, feel free to let them rip away.
I will say, I think my best tip for remembering is just make sure you tune in every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central to catch Gally and myself talking about fantasy football.
I just want to say the morning shows are doing something for you, my friend. One day in the big chair, one day hosting on a Monday, and the guy's got plugs on plugs. Next thing you know, he'll be dropping segues. So nice. We look at that blank canvas and that blank slate. It's a little daunting when you see it. But when you first logged in, what was the first thing you did in 2023-24 fantasy EPL?
I hit the X on every single player that was in my team. I didn't want to look at a single player there. I wanted to just have nothing. And I wanted to make sure that I was starting from absolute zero and not having any sort of thoughts or memories of ending of last year. Because it didn't end so well for myself, unfortunately. So that is the first thing I did. Well, actually, I lied. The first thing I did was I had to re-update my account. I don't know if everyone had to do that, but it took me through like 4 different steps to get there. So that's what I did first, to be honest. And then I saw that I have to go and clear out my entire team. And then from there, I put in Holland, and I just sat on that for about 3 days. It just didn't do anything else. I just threw in Holland, and I said, okay, I'll get around to the rest, but this is a good start.
So it's an interesting point, and I think it almost speaks to David Cosgrove's second comment here. Haha. So as long as Mo is captain, we are halfway there. And it's funny you say that, because there was a time in this game where you put Mo Salah in your team, like you did. To the first thing you did, you click on him, you find him, you put the armband on him, and then you left it that way for 3 months. I think the pricing, the way the game has changed, I do believe that there is a little bit of a shift, obviously. We'll talk a little bit about some of the prices and the surprises that we saw. But with Holland coming in at 14 million, I know he's a no-brainer, especially when it comes to his expected ownership. But I got to be honest, it is a tough one to think about it. There are ways to fit both players into your side, but it's really, really difficult to balance that team out if you have both Holland and Mo. I mean, you're using over a quarter of your salary in 2 players, 26.5 million. And then when you add in the fact that the folks that created this game made a ton of value in cheap to middle price midfielders, that when you start weighing the 12.5s to 8.5s to 9.5s, it does make it more and more difficult. As Liverpool supporters, I think it's very easy to put Mo into your side. At the same time, to John Carl's comment here, evening, gents. The first time actually giving a crap about fantasy since around 2016. Went with Salah right away, and we're just riding the wave. Now, I'll tell you what, I have a draft that is my no Holland draft. I think there is 0.0% chance I will start the season with it, but I won't lie. It was my first initial thought going into this year, was thinking about being a player who actually tries to attack this game by basically banking maybe on a slow start for the machine. But the machine comes out in preseason and just starts racking up goals like it's his job, because it's all he cares about doing. So I swear this guy might have gotten the actual segue cards that I had earlier, because I wanted to talk Holland and captains and maybe the expensive players, but go into formation when we talk about how you build your team. So I'd say in the past, 3-4-3 was probably the preferred formation when I first started playing fantasy in like 2013-14, mainly because of defensive players not really getting forward. The wingback system creating from the wide areas wasn't the fullback's job yet. And strikers were really priced to score. As time's gone on, I think the formation has shifted to 4-4-2 being probably the optimal formation that most fantasy managers play. And I've heard a lot of people talking about a 3-5-1 this year with how valuable, or 3-5-2, I'm sorry, with how valuable they see the midfield area being. Do you have an idea yet of what formation you think your best 11 will be after you build out your final roster for next week?
3-5-2. I think if you look at the pricing for the midfielders this year, I think it's set up so easily to have 5 really good, really well-priced options there and feel good about them week to week. I feel much better about all 5 of my midfield options than I do 4 of my defender options. And that's only because, especially at the beginning of the year, we're not quite sure how defensively teams will fare. Last year we assumed that City would keep a bunch of clean sheets at the beginning of the season. We had some City defenders in. That didn't happen, right? So we had Liverpool defenders in last year for clean sheets. That didn't happen too. So I think in looking at the prices and what I know defensively going into the season is that I'm not going to bank on clean sheets anymore. I'm going to put in some defenders that I feel like have good threat going forward and kind of just go off of that and then have my 5 midfielders make up for any sort of potential defensive deficiencies. Because you can still get the 1 point for the clean sheet as a midfielder. I know it's definitely it's not the same as getting 6 points from your defender. But when clean sheets are so tough to come by, especially at the beginning of the year, I feel like investing more into the midfield will definitely prove to be a better option. That's why I think when we talk about the template, a lot of the template has 5 midfielders just because you have so much value in 5 midfielders this year, at least with the pricing.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think there's also the fact that there aren't many yet. And, we still have 2 weeks, maybe 10 days left and probably one more preseason match for each side. And then a really big match in the Community Shield. I think that's more important than most Community Shields because it's going to give you an insight into both Arsenal and Arsenal's thinking for sure, less so much City, because we know Pep could send out 8 guys and then none of them could start. He could start 3 youth players on the first match of the season, and it really wouldn't shock you. The only thing that would be shocking is if Phil Foden is in my team, which he is, and he's actually starting. Because he just ruins fantasy teams. He's basically the Reece James of Manchester. But we'll get into the guys that are going to ruin my season before the season even begins. But I think when you talk about the template, I do think there is some credence here for the 5 midfielders. I think the other part is there's no budget enabling midfielders. Like, I don't think there's a 4.5. There is no Andre Pereira out there this year. There is no even De Silva to start last year. Guys, you thought, the 4 million Lundstrom defender playing in midfield at one point, the top of the spear for Sheffield United for a month. That was arguably like the greatest move I ever did. I had him from the beginning of the season. I just got lucky. I read he was going to start. So I put him on my team. Next thing I know, he's my 3rd highest scorer 3 months in. There's moves like that. I think when you look at the defensive areas, and we're going to talk a little bit about specific ones that I think are a little bit competitive for basically positions from the top sides. But let's take a look at the fixture tracker. It's hard to see. I know it's brought to you here. This actually is something that comes from our friends over at Fantasy Football Scout. They do a great job. This is basically their fixture ticker. So it allows you to adjust how many games you want to see. And it tells you basically who has the best fixtures coming over attack, defense, or aggregate between both. Not really a surprise to me when you look at the names on the fixture list that Chelsea sits atop the ticker over the first 8 game weeks. Little surprising Everton's second, and when you see those fixtures, they really do scream like if Sean Dyche gets the defensive order at all right. You could see why so many people have Pickford in their sides, why so many people are even starting to jump on Tarkowski before the latest, injury of Dominic Calvert-Lewin. I heard some people actually leaning that way. At one point, he was in my side because I think he could have a bounce back year, and at $6 million seems really cheap. But again, Arsenal, United. So it's the usual teams that we expect to see towards the top. Any of these specific sides, ones that you are either attacking, top or bottom, or sticking away from to start the season?
I think, and part of my strategy for this year is thinking about just historically how the season start, and kind of to just not put too much stock into the first 1 or 2 game weeks, because it's hard to tell how teams are actually going to play. And so if you bandwagon on the clubs that played really well last year, that kept most of their pieces, that usually is a pretty good success. So I'm not trying to deviate from that too much.
Yep.
So I think having a few City assets, a few United assets, a few Arsenal assets. I might have a couple Spurs assets actually, because I think Postecoglou's setup is really interesting. I think with Tottenham being a lot more attacking this year, I think that opens up more flexibility in their attacking options. Especially, we still don't know what's going to happen to Kane. So whether he stays or goes, that's going to change a lot of people's minds, depending on how they're set up right now. But I think overall, when I'm looking at it, I'm going a bunch of City, bunch of United, bunch of Arsenal, couple Liverpool, and that's pretty much going to round out my team, because then the rest will just end up on the bench.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I'm very similar in some of my formats with you. There's a couple. I really like the Brighton fixtures, and I like the Brighton team. I will say I have concerns over Brighton, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. I have concerns over Brighton playing in Europe, and the fact that they're actually a much deeper squad than people realize. They bought a lot of good players. They have more young, good South American talent coming behind all these players. So I think De Zerbi is going to rotate a little bit this year. And I think that could make the Premier League a little more difficult, because I think if you're Brighton and you're living it up on the South Coast, playing in that great little stadium they have with their awesome supporters, right? Don't you have to go all in for the Europa League? Like, don't you have to make sure you get out of the group stage and like maybe end up playing a match in Italy or like in a big city stadium? I mean, who knows? Atletico Madrid could get bombed out of the Champions League, and Brighton could be going to, you know what I mean? Like to Atletico Madrid, like, and to a club like that, I understand, because let's be real. If Tottenham has a good year with the new manager and Harry Kane stays, if West Ham plays up a level to the talent they had last year, Chelsea plays better, Brighton may be nowhere near sniffing Europe, even if they have another great season. There's no guarantee. Now, I personally think if things go right for them, they may be Newcastle and trying to compete for Champions League spots. Like, I think they're a really talented side. I also think they have a better chance of probably using using English money and trying to actually win in the Europa League than they do actually getting in the top 4 in the Premier League. So I think you have to weigh that into account when you talk about Villa assets. And I think you have to weigh that into account when you talk about Brighton assets, because they're both going to be asked to play a ton more matches this year on different schedules. And I think it's going to lead to a lot more rotation. So I want to talk a few minutes here about some of the guys that I think are going to give some managers headaches. And in each of these scenarios, they're more or less players on the same team. So they're similar players, maybe slightly different priced, but their overall projections are pretty similar. And I was just wondering, like, if I brought these two slides up, right?
Yeah.
And you saw John Stones at $5.5 million and Nathan Ake at $5 million. You'd think that John Stones would be this much higher producing player, yet he only had a few more overall points than Ake did last year. Both were relatively healthy. I think they both made about 32 to 35 starts, something like that. How much stock do you put into Stones playing into the inverted role and being a little bit more forward compared to maybe Ake having more of a prowess on set pieces for an opportunity for goals?
See, I think with Stones being a little bit more inverted, and he is also a threat on corner kicks too. He's so I think overall the $500,000 here is justifiable to go up to Stones, because I think overall he can impact the play a little more in a couple different ways than Ake can, especially if he's playing that inverted role. He's going to be on the ball a bit more, and when you talk about that, you talk about potential bonus points that you get. And so overall, I think he just has that ability to just slightly. I know it would only be slightly outscoring, but it's also still only $500,000. And if you're going to trust a certain player on that back line, I would go with Stones over Ake. Now, with Gvardiol coming in, we don't know what that's going to look like, whether that pushes one of these guys out potentially, or if it changes sort of how we see the back line and how Stones plays if he is in with Gvardiol and Ake. So I think between these two, having Stones having that extra layer of threat offensively pushes him just over the edge for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have Ake in my side right now. I had Stones in there earlier. We'll talk about the strategy of putting our teams together when we look at our drafts as of this evening. My only thing with Stones is he's had the injury problems and he goes in and out of form so quickly, where I think Ake actually almost proved last year that he was almost undroppable because he doesn't do anything so flashy, but he never makes mistakes. And I think Guardiola actually trusts him as much as any other defender in his entire side. And I mean, they just gave him a 5-year contract. It's crazy to think they tried to sell him to Chelsea last offseason to make money. And then he won himself a starting job. And in classic Guardiola fashion, he's like, nah, I'll just go sell 3 other defenders that I paid more for than you. And then in 2 years, I'll sell you and I'll make money off you too. I'm leaning a little bit towards Ake, but I don't disagree. I think the Gvardiol coming in makes me a little nervous about what he's going to do with that back line, because he has a Kanji, he has Gvardiol now, he's still got Ruben Diaz, Laporte's still there, and then you have Stones. So it's like, well, I guess, what is that old saying? The rich just keep on getting richer. So this next one is what I believe is one of the hardest decisions in the entire game right now. And it's to have 1 or 2, but no matter what. Oh, sorry. It's this slide. It's to have 1, to have 2. But if you're only going to have, which one do you take? So I had the sneak peek of your team. So I know you went with option B and you have 2.
Yes, sir.
So why don't you explain to me why you believe Martinelli and Saka are the choices here over Odegaard at this point, the player who had more points last season than either?
The $500,000 you get from going to Martinelli from Odegaard helps move $500,000 up on the back line for me in that situation. So for me, it was between Saka and Odegaard, and between those two, it's hard to pass up Saka. I think Saka's a little underpriced this year, to be honest. I'm surprised he's not at 9. And I think with him being on penalties, I think, and that's another thing to think about, is a lot of the time, especially when you're in the first couple of weeks, getting guys who are on penalties, getting guys who are taking free kicks, getting guys who are going to be whipping those crosses in on corners, those are guys to target because you know they're going to have the minutes, you know they're going to have the opportunity to score. And so having Saka and Martinelli for me made more sense than Odegaard and Martinelli, because I wanted Martinelli for sure, because I think at 8 million, I still think that's amazing value. Last year was amazing value. I think this year is still great value. So I knew I was going to have Martinelli. So it really came down to Saka versus Odegaard. And at that point, at the same price, I can't justify going over the penalty kick taker.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I will disagree slightly that Martinelli is great value at 8 million. I think he's really good priced at 8 million. He's much better priced than he was last year at 6 million, which was just ridiculously low. And, you know, it was just a steal for players. I do believe that Saka is worth the extra $500,000. And we're going to talk a little bit about prices in a moment after we look at that other slide that I jumped over. But I agree with you. I think Saka was a surprise to me. I thought he'd be 9. I thought he could have even been 9.5. when I saw where some of the other players came in. So I think Saka actually is kind of priced at this point to make this decision difficult between him and Odegaard. And I think they did this deliberately where there were about 3 or 4 players, in my opinion, that were $500,000 to $1 million cheaper than they should have been at the midfield positioning. But I really believe that was to deter players or to entice players to not have Haaland and Salah both in their lineups. It just got really boring last year when the 2 best players week in and week out were in 60 to 70% of all sides. So I think they really did try to make that a little bit more competitive. Personally, I like Martinelli. I do get nervous about a little bit of the rotation for them this year because they're not playing in the Europa League, where they actually, the only rotation they did last year was in the Europa League. This is Arsenal in the Champions League, and something they've never won and something these young kids all want to be part of. So I could see Arsenal not taking a step back, but I think they've strengthened to the point by buying Havertz. They have more faith in Nketiah. Granted, now you hear that Gabriel Jesus is going to be out for a bit. So what does that do to him? They have Trossard. Emile Smith-Rowe, though he's not banging in like he was 2 years ago, he's still a really quality player. You know, if I knew Martinelli was going to start through the middle to start the season, I'd be all in at 8 million and I'd be super excited. It does make me a little bit nervous, and I also don't know, and I know this is crazy to say, but Granit Xhaka didn't get half the credit he deserved for making the left-hand side of the Arsenal attack actually work last year. It was the best year of football I've ever seen him play. He was really good, and I think he actually was really instrumental in feeding Martinelli. If they continue with what they're doing right now, and Declan Rice plays in that role, and Thomas plays at the 6, look out. Declan Rice might be a guy that's worth looking at 5 million, because he might just be a steal, because he's going to actually be popping up forward in the place that Xhaka was, and that's a better footballer. I think in the long run, it'll be Rice playing in the holding 6, and it'll be Havertz and Odegaard playing in the midfield 2. And I don't love Havertz playing behind anyone, because he's just this really talented, tall, good-looking footballer that can't actually play football, in my opinion. And I think that makes me nervous about the left-hand side of Arsenal's attack.
That's fair.
Something I never like to talk about is the high quality at Manchester United, but there is a lot of quality right now from a fantasy perspective, especially, in my opinion, the 2 guys on the screen right now. Now, I think this $500,000 is a much more interesting argument, and I think you can make a strong case that if you're looking to strengthen a position or save a little money in the bank, you might be making a big mistake not taking Bruno Fernandes over Rashford this season. And I know everyone loves Rashford, but he was hot and cold last year for as many goals as he scored. The one consistent thing in United's offense is when Bruno Fernandes is allowed to push forward, he creates goals. Well, as long as Cristiano Ronaldo's not wearing a uniform on the pitch. And again, to your point earlier, we're talking about a guy who is on all set pieces, free kicks, and penalties. You give me that $500,000. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I think I take the rat face.
Yeah, there's no question in my mind you take Bruno over Rashford in this situation. I think there's an argument to be made to have both potentially in your midfield. If you want to work around that, I think that's fair. But if you're deciding between these 2, I don't see a world where it would make sense to go with Rashford, considering the price and considering what Bruno is on that you already mentioned, and how instrumental he is to everything United offensively. We saw that before Ronaldo came there when Bruno was one of the best fantasy assets. And we saw this then flashes of that again post Ronaldo last year, kind of back to how, where the 10.5 million Bruno was being priced was like, this was the Bruno. And now to have him at 8.5, I mean, at the same price as Saka, those are 2 maybe of the easiest decisions in the midfield for me specifically. So like looking at Haaland, Saka and Bruno, I feel like is a really strong start to the three. But I feel like the nice thing about having this sort of diversity in the midfield is that we're going to see a lot more variety of teams. I think last year, and we talked about this last year, and we maybe alluded to a little bit earlier. For a long stretch of time, everyone had pretty much the same team, right? I mean, there might maybe have been one or two differences in defense or on the bench, but for the most part, people just had the same team because the way things were priced, it just made sense. Whereas this year, you have a lot of arguments between just having one premium asset, having two premium assets, having three premium assets, even having four. I mean, and so I like that the discourse of this year is much more varied than it was last year. It kind of got boring last year because it was the same thing over and over. Whereas this year, there's a lot more to consider.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think part of it last year was it was Haaland and what do you do? And there were ways. I mean, I think at one point for like 4 weeks, I had Haaland, Kane, and Salah in my lineup. And I wasn't even that chafed about it because I filled it out with Martinelli's and Matomas and, like fodder that didn't need to worry. And I was like, and I'm a guy who normally advocates 15 players that are all playing every week. And that way, when you get auto subbed, you don't whine and cry like you forgot to set your lineup. You don't have to worry about it because you got guys who start and can score all over the place. I mean, you still whine and cry because it's the easiest thing to do in this game is complain about the rules. Yes. But I think what it comes down to with this season is they claimed they were going to drastically change the game. They didn't. There were no new rule changes or we would have started with all of that. There's no new chips being introduced, which is really disappointing. I was hoping for something. New substitution patterns, later kickoffs, locking rosters different times. Like I was hoping they were going to drastically do something to make the strategy different. They didn't. What they did was they changed the pricing to make the competitive balance different. Because ultimately what happened last year was the people who really paid attention, they saw green arrows from basically week 20 forward. If you were paying attention last year, you could basically read a blog or two and follow your way to double and triple match weeks. But we talk about it before, right? It really comes down to the chip usage and the captaincy picks every week. And I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to keep saying it, and maybe this year I'll actually abide by it. You can't take more than like 6 total hits all year. It's somewhere between it's like 6 and 10. It really is. It's like 6 and 10 -4 hits. Because if you think about it, with rolling transfers, 2 wild cards, a free hit, like you ultimately don't need to take that many hits. And that comes back to not putting all your eggs in expensive buckets, right? And having a rotatable bench. So you can look at something and say, you know what, for these 3 fixtures, and I'm going to try this year to be better with this. Like I'm going to try very hard to not make 1 week transfers. And if I do take a hit, it's for a reconstruction. And a reconstruction should last for 4 to 6 weeks. Those same 4 to 6 weeks you're able to track out on the trackers of what teams have good fixtures coming. If I'm going to bring in a defender, it should be because he's here. They're going to play 3 of the next 4 game weeks, like not bringing a guy to fill a spot on the bench to create 0.5 so I can move from, Rashford to Bruno Fernandes or whatever small little sidestep move. And I think that is very important. And I think understanding your team and having a plan comes to understanding the prices. So before we look at our sides, price surprises. You mentioned one earlier. I think Saka at 8.5 was a surprise. John Carl mentions Trent, saying Trent, given his new inverted role, was a must for me, even though he was quite pricey. And I will say, 8 million is a lot for a defender. Now, I've always said if you look at Trent's scoring, he basically scores as if he's a midfielder.
Right.
So if you think of him like having a 6 midfielder, would you pay 8 million if they classified Trent as a midfielder this year, knowing what he could give you in fantasy output? You'd say yes. And the fact that if Liverpool is lucky enough to get a single clean sheet all season long, which might happen more if they actually move Trent to midfield. if those things happen, then it's just gravy, right? And then the bonus points he can churn out. Any worry on either his corners or his set piece duties getting cut back, having both McAllister and Sloboslai in the side?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I think at least corners from the right side, I think, are still Trent's at the moment. We've seen
He did
Soboslai.
not. He did not. Those were actually the corners that he took yesterday were from the right side. Robertson took his corners. It was Trent that lost his corners in the match against Bayern.
I could have sworn Soboslai was taking them for Robbo.
Robertson took it. They had a big point. I watched a fantasy Premier League show this morning, and they talked about how Trent lost corners in his first time. The other time that Sloboslai took them was when Trent was off the pitch in the second preseason match. But yesterday, Robertson took 3 and Sloboslai took 2. Trent did take 1 for the assist. Oh, no. Actually, it was Sloboslai who took the 1 for the assist, which was on the right-hand side.
Well, it was Robbo's side.
No. It was on Trent's side, where Trent normally takes them on the right-hand side of the pitch. Am I wrong about that?
I feel like I'm in the Twilight Zone. Maybe I'm just completely flipping everything in my head.
You were watching it and trying to do a show at the same time.
Yeah, if you try and do a watch along, you guys, with Timuchin, there's no way you can pay attention to the actual game. I'm just going to say that up front.
I'm fair. You're absolutely right, because I honestly have to be honest. I had to at times put the phone down because I caught myself talking with you guys instead of watching the game.
I love that. I'm honestly really curious. I'm just going to go ahead and, while you talk about it a little bit more, I'm just going to look this goal up from Van Dijk here really quick.
I thought I saw the assist was his, but I could be wrong because they made such a big deal about the ball being so perfectly delivered. And maybe it was Trent that delivered it, because obviously Trent's got a wand of a right foot.
No, you're right. It was.
Yeah, he took. I couldn't remember which one took it, but I think Robertson. They were making a point about it that, because I was more afraid with Robertson. So when we talk about the surprise prices, so Trent's $8 million. I'm a little worried with the set pieces, but we'll see. Another one that I thought. You mentioned earlier being a little bullish on the Spurs players. Talent is talent. And the idea that they dropped Son's price by $2.5 million. I mean, it is so enticing at 9. If I knew Harry Kane would be there for the first month, you know what? I'd be making those $500,000 moves that we talked about earlier, dropping to Ake, dropping to Fernandez, so I could get up to Son. Because I think he could have a monster season under the new manager. He seems to love players like that, like pacey wingers who come in off the sides. Sounds like it's like built right up his alley. I'm also not that afraid if Kane does leave, as long as they get some form of a player that Son can play off of. Because I think Son's proven he can be the best player on a team. He's not better than Harry Kane, but he's a really, really good player. And then you find out that he had a sports hernia all of last season that he never told anyone about because he barely speaks English and all he does is smile. So he never complained about the injuries he was going through. So you kind of understand why he had such a down season. I think he could be one that just rebounds. What are your thoughts on Son? Do you think 9 million's too low? Do you think it's just right?
I think if we take everything we knew about Son out for a second and kind of contextualized it based on what it was last year, we would think that, if anything, he might have been a little too expensive this year without thinking about anything historically that he's done. But given what he's been able to do over the last several years, I think the 9 is just right for this year, given what happened last year. And I think it's a very, very interesting idea to be able to go with Son and Bruno and Martinelli and Saka. And you can still fit Eze in there, right? And so, I mean, I think it's one of those things where if I saw Son in a team, I would take a look and go, I think that's a good spot for him right there. I don't think there's anything wrong with going with Son. And it opens up the door for really loading up on those midfielders, because you could essentially do 5 8 to 9 million priced midfielders, still have room for Holland up front, maybe do like a Jackson at Chelsea, especially if Nkunku's going to be down for a little bit. Having Jackson there is a little bit cheaper to have that as that second forward. It's a really interesting proposition.
I got to ask you, before we look at our teams, what are you making of Chelsea? Everyone said there'll be this huge exodus and they're going to have to sell all these players. And they did sell half a squad to Saudi Arabia. I'm pretty sure they are actually fielding an entire team in Saudi Arabia next season. But they've also bought a whole nother squad. Yet for once, these are all young players with like really good upsides and really good player profiles. Do you think they're giving Pochettino exactly what he never had at Spurs, which is like they're feeding him young players to make that much better? At Spurs, they told him, like, take these young players and make them good. And don't get me wrong, he gave Harry Kane his chance, so he deserves all the credit, but he got lucky there. He didn't have a striker. He started a guy. The mouth breather went out, and 10 years later has been the best striker in the Premier League since it started. So, there's a little luck in anything there. But do you think they're actually listening to the manager, filling his side with players he wants to coach that he thinks he can turn into a real squad? Because if it works with Pochettino there, the actual coach that Poch is, could be scary for the Premier League when you add in the talent and the buying power.
And the fact that they don't have to worry about any rotation because they're not in Europe. So that's another big thing, is that clubs like Chelsea and Spurs, they don't need to worry about that rotation. That makes playing and choosing guys from these teams, it makes you feel a little bit more confident knowing that they'll get 90 minutes because they don't have to worry about having players for Europa or the Conference League or Champions League. And so I think if the Poch project works exactly how they envision it to work, they have the talent on the team. I personally believe they have the talent on the team to compete for top 3. It's just a matter of if the pieces will all click together in the right time. And I think the likes of, especially from a fantasy aspect, saying with that in mind, guys like Chilwell, guys like Reece James again, we bring his name up quite a bit, but if they can get it going, those two guys defensively for what they're priced at, those would be absolutely good bargains. I mean, if Colwill is a regular starter at $4.5 million, like that's
key for me.
Yeah. So, I mean, you take these things into account. I mean, it's just like they can really flip the league upside down, fantasy wise.
If Colwell ends up being a starter at $4.5 million, it'll be a no-brainer. I'll probably downgrade the City asset, whether it is Stones or Ake, to him. Their fixtures are good. You can sit them in the first match against Liverpool, whatever. Yep. But their fixtures are really good. They start out well. I'm a little nervous about Reece James and Chilwell because they get injured just so often, and they just have such problems with injuries. And I hate the idea of making transfers early in the season because you're bringing in guys you're not sure of. But I do hear the shout on them. What about the new keeper at it? Onana comes in. He's priced at $5 million. It's $500,000 less than Shaw. If you really want to get into United's defense, another side with good fixtures, to start the season overall, especially from a defensive standpoint. And anyone who watched the Champions League final or paid attention to Serie A last year, I think his numbers in all of Europe, he had like the second or third highest percentage for accurate distribution. So right then and there, that in the EPL fantasy, you are going to be up for bonus points because they take percentage of passes and completed passes by defenders as like a much higher level, which is why David Raya got so many bonus points last season along with all the saves. So I've read a lot of people saying like Onana is the easiest decision in fantasy this year. He's a 5 million keeper that you start all 38 game weeks. You feel that confident about the player? They did have a good season when it came to clean sheets, even though they had a calamitous goalkeeper.
But that defense hasn't changed. You know, the chances will still be there for the other teams. Like I feel like, yes, Onana has at this point in their careers is more quality than De Gea is, but they didn't change anything defensively. They're still going to have some of those problems at the back. They're still going to let up some of those easy chances. So I don't think it's necessarily so cut and dry. I think, especially if you're spending 5 on a keeper this year, that's fine. I personally am not spending more than 4.5 on a keeper this year. I think that's sort of where I am at right now. And because you alluded to Brighton earlier having some good fixtures to start out with, I think having someone like Steele in there is a little bit better value at 4.5 than Onana at 5. Because I do trust Brighton's defense a little bit more based on what we saw last year. And so I think the people saying Onana is the easiest decision, I don't quite understand where that's coming from. I disagree wholeheartedly. I think he is a great keeper, but at the end of the day, the keeper is just as good as that back line sometimes. I mean, and you have to remember that there were moments last year where that defense was just absolutely shambolic. And there's no reason for me to think otherwise until we see otherwise.
Yeah, I don't disagree. It's not like they went out and brought in. They didn't sign Gvardiol. They didn't sign, a Virgil van Dijk-esque level player. Lissandro Martinez is a nice player, works really, really hard. You can't argue it. And everyone knows Varane has the talents, but also that he's injury prone. And if your backups are Lindelof and Harry Maguire, you still got to question it when you're more willing to play a young kid like Malacia on the left and play Luke Shaw at a center back. It lets you know you really don't have depth there. So I actually agree with you. It just stuck out to me because I had heard so many folks talking about it. One guy that I think is poorly priced, and I can't see him being in my side at all this year, is Andy Robertson. We talked about him earlier. I think 6.5 million is extremely high. I think the fact that we saw last year that he stopped being able to go forward once Trent's role switched and he started going more into the inverted right winger because they asked him to defend more. I think Liverpool's frailty at the back is going to hurt him again. And he also just looks like he's knackered and tired constantly, which makes me think at some point rotation has to set in. Robertson, anyone that you think will come into your FPL plans at any point, unless there's a big change in form?
No, it's not like it was a few years ago where it was kind of set and forget with Robbo and Trent. I think we're past that point. There wasn't a single second where I saw the name and I thought, maybe. I pretty much in my head, the name does not exist on my team.
Yeah. Speaking of your team, so you told us a little bit already, right? We know about Martinelli and Saka. You mentioned it. I can see you got Bruno in there. We talked a little bit about Steele. So why don't you work through your back line, and then let's talk about the decision-making at the bench.
So, okay, I will first and foremost, the bench, don't pay any mind to that. I just wanted to sort of fill it out just to be able to have something concrete to send over.
Of course.
So that's still being worked on. There's no, like you mentioned earlier, there's not real amazing fodder value like Andres Pereira last year, where you can just put it in there and not have to worry about it. So at the moment, not much to focus on there. As far as the back line goes, we talked about Brighton's figures, and I like Brighton's defense. And I think Estupiñán is pretty nicely priced at 5 million. Seeing how high up he gets on the pitch and how he's able to be part of the attack more often than not. We saw flashes of it last year, and I think at 5 million is pretty good value. Gabriel, again, probably Arsenal's most consistent defender last year, and he's still a set piece threat. So I think as long as Arsenal's defense isn't kind of as bad as it was towards the end of the year, and we kind of see the Arsenal of early from last year, I think Gabriel is going to be great value at 5 million. And then Pedro Porro, I think that's more of a hey, I like Postecoglou and I like how he's trying to set up. And I think if Pedro Porro goes up as much as he does, I think he could be a really sneaky good 4.5 or 5 million player that gets up and down that left side. So that's kind of how I saw the back line there. And like I said before earlier in the show, I think going with 3 defenders in the back is just how I'm going to attack the first several weeks, because I'd much rather invest more in the midfield and that scoring threat than have to bank on some clean sheets.
So I got to ask you, we're Liverpool supporters, but I got to ask you about Gakpo. The process between this of who's going to start, who's going to play, where the minute's going to come, when's the rotation going to happen, as well as what positions on the pitch players are going to play, because he's starting to toy with playing Gakpo even in the midfield at times and having him drop back. I think he's a tremendous player. No nerves at all spending 7.5?
7.5, yeah.
Like no nervousness at all about a player that literally is competing with both Jota and Darwin for minutes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's tons of nerves. So I think I'm just excited by the prospect that I think if Gakpo does start, I think he will give you a return most games. Just kind of the player that he is. It just comes down to if he's going to be starting or not. I know the minutes will be tough to get to. So I out of everyone on my team that you see there, I think Gakpo, as a Maddison, most likely those are the 3 that I still probably will move away from. If there's going to be anyone I move away from, it's those 3. I feel so rotten not having a single Liverpool asset. But I couldn't go with Trent because of the price tag. I didn't want to go with Mo because it priced me out of a few other midfielders. And between Jota, Gakpo, and Nunez, I thought Gakpo has the best chance of starting the first couple weeks, and I feel most confident in him there specifically. So I think that's what my thought process was for him specifically.
And I totally understand it. Any idea quickly as we wrap this up, and then I'll kind of look at my team real quick, and we'll go much deeper into this next week as we're only going to be a day away, and hopefully we'll be a lot closer to our final rosters.
Yeah.
You have Areola there because you assume he's going to be named the number 1 at West Ham. Is that your thought process?
Yeah, and he's 4 million. So if you're going to have a potential starting keeper at 4 million, having him on the bench it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I know some folks who are actually going with 2 4 million keepers, assuming that he and Hennessy might start week 1 and allow you that. I will say the rumors that Matt Turner might be in line for a move to Nottingham Forest and become their number 1 keeper at 4 million is actually really enticing because Forest has some decent fixtures. And I'm a big Matt Turner fan. I watched him a lot when he was with the New England Revolution. I was clamoring for him to be USA's number 1 when he was, I think, their 3rd or 4th keeper, because I can't stand Zach Steffen. But sorry, Zach. But yeah, I think that could be that's a sneaky one, right? Like these are the types of things. Maybe the Trevanier kid ends up being the starter at Burnley. You got a 4.5 million keeper, so you got to pay attention. I think sometimes late transfers are things that people miss, like players getting transferred when like. Last year, Cole Palmer almost went to Southampton. And if he had gone to Southampton, he probably would have started the entire season as like their striker, as like a $4.5 million striker. So at one point I had him in my team and people were making fun of me. They were like, what the hell is wrong with you? You're wasting a City asset on him? And I'm like, well, he's there because I think he's going to Southampton. If he doesn't, I'll switch it. And I did. But I think that's something that people do miss sometimes in jumping and actually taking a look. So any other ideas around your bench? Because I mean, you'd be in trouble if you went into the season with that bench.
No, I honestly, I've kind of, because I'm looking at my team on this side too. There's not much that I was really taking too much time on to invest in my bench at the moment. I really just wanted to figure out how I liked my midfield assets together and then go off there. So in the next week, I'll have that all taken care of. And I think we'll see which direction I go. I just haven't spent that much time on my bench, to be honest.
Totally understood. So this is my side here. It's very similar in a lot of ways. I have Pickford and Areola as my keepers. I mentioned earlier Everton's fixture list. As much as it pains me to have Jordan Pickford in my side, Jordan Pickford is a really good fantasy asset. He creates lots of saves with his little arms. He actually has statistically one of the highest points per game average and points per million of any keeper since he's been in the Premier League, which is weird, even though he plays for Everton. He also has, I think, 6 penalty saves in his career, which you don't get a lot of them, but it's a big 5-point swing. If you get a keeper to save 2-3 penalties a season, those 15-20 points is, good 100,000 places at the end of the year. People don't realize. I have Ake, Estupiñán, and Gabriel at the back right now. My midfield is not that far off. We talked about the whole Rashford and Bruno Fernandes. I've gone back and forth on that. I probably will end up with Bruno Fernandes when the season starts. I too have Eze and Saka. I went with Foden. I wasn't going to go with Foden. He's basically like Reece James Jr. When it comes to ruining my team. But I truly believe this is the year of Phil Foden. Like, I think this is the year he might become their most influential midfielder and actually take Kevin De Bruyne's job. I genuinely think that Pep has been grooming him to take De Bruyne's job. And I think De Bruyne, once again crying his way off a big match in the Champions League final. And I feel bad for the guy. But you walked off the pitch twice in Champions League finals and once in a World Cup knockout game. And every time you went to the bench, sat there and sat with your teammates. And I've said it before, if you're fit enough to stay on the side of the pitch, at least be fit enough to rip something before you beg your way off. And it feels like when times get tough, Kevin De Bruyne asks out. And he's getting older. And it's a classic Pep maneuver to kind of slowly phase him out, in my opinion, or even drop him further back. And the fact that Mahrez left leaves a huge hole on the right. So it gives Foden a starting spot even to go. And for me, the points that Haaland looked the best last year is when Foden was playing on the wing with him. He just seems to find him. So I'm going to roll with Foden, I think. I'm pretty sure he's going to be in my side to start the year. Recently, I brought Nick Jackson in. Also, Baldock is a $4 million starting defender. So I'm just basically playing the numbers there. I feel really good with this side because I know that I can make moves in a lot of different ways. And to your point earlier, I'm looking at a side here that has goal threats at defense in Estupiñán and Gabriel, has penalty takers in Mbeumo, Saka, Eze, and Haaland. We don't know yet if Jackson will be taking him, but I have a feeling he will be. So I have Trent, and I have hopefully a starting forward in Vinicius, which I could switch out, but he's $5 million, so he gives me a lot of flexibility. This side still has $500,000 in it. So I'm at 99.5. That is my goal. I am planning to start the season with $500,000 in the bank. Because I always have these grand ideas about 2 and 3 week transfers, like rolling my first transfer, rolling my second transfer, and in match week 3, doing a little reconstruction with a -4 even. Like, I have all these ideas, and every year I'm capped to the limit, and someone goes up 0.1, and the guy I want to get rid of goes down 0.1, and I can't make the move. So I think having $500,000 in the bank to start the season is a strategy that I've read other kind of, I hate to say like professional, but really high up managers, folks who do this and, give advice and people pay them for it.
Make a living
right?
off of it.
Make a living off of writing articles. They're sharing that as something that's helped them, and they can almost see it in their first month changing almost like a -8. Because it allows you to not take a -4 to make the move that you feel is so confident. And a lot of times that move ends up being the -8 because you make the -4 and then the other guy scores higher, etc. So I'm trying that maneuver right now. The guys up here that are definitely on the chopping block for me, would be Ake, could be to go to Stones. Rashford could be to go to Fernandez. And then alternate strikers. I mentioned earlier, Sunday is going to be really important for me because if Eddie Nketiah starts in the Community Shield up front for Arsenal, I think I make Vinicius Eddie Nketiah for $5.5 million, and I let him play the first month.
Yeah.
And if I do that, I'll be honest, I may take Jackson, drop him all the way down to a fodder, and I may try to take Eze and go all the way up to like Son, and go with, like you talked about, the really big midfield, where I feel like I have like 5 high-quality midfielders. Now, I also had a draft where I had and Cisco from Brighton instead of Eze, saves me $1 million, allows me to take Jackson up to Watkins, and then allows me to tweak other players. There I can drop Rashford down, save that $500,000 I would need to have my extra $500,000 in the bank. I've also had a draft where I had Kepa as my keeper. But to your point, I really believe like going to a $5 million keeper is a really stretch when you see the amount of $4.5 million keepers that make sense between, Johnson at Crystal Palace, Pickford, Leno at Fulham. I think once Raya gets sold, Flecken at Brentford makes a lot of sense. Like there are a ton of keepers. Even the guy Vizcaino or whatever it is at Tottenham. I think there are a lot of keepers at $4.5 million that make a lot of sense. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I still have a lot of moving parts. And then, of course, I mentioned it earlier. If Levi Colwell is an every match starter, and it looks that way going into the season, I probably drop that City defender down to him, pick up another $500,000. And now I really start to really tweak where I'm putting that money. Maybe I can get to Iwanu at 6.5 as a striker. I like the balance of this side. I really do. I feel like they all could contribute. My biggest problem is every time I want to make a move, it's moving Eze out, and I just feel like the kid is going to have an absolute, I feel it's his last year at Crystal Palace, and he's going to be, I honestly think he's not only going to be their talisman, I think he's going to quickly make them forget Wilfried Zaha. And that says a lot when a kid's been there since he was 14 and meant everything to your club for a decade.
Yeah. I was going to say, I have $3 million in the bank. And so I thought about going from Eze to Son and still having $500,000, which would be fine. But to your point, I threw Eze into my team right away for a reason. And I know that I mentioned he was one of the 3 that might see some movement, but it's tough to go against the 6.5 and against the guy that's going to be the guy at Palace. And we saw glimpses of it last year. And I think overall, it's a great, great choice to have.
Yeah, it really is. It's going to be tough. This is going to be tough for me because I actually really like the sides that I've built. The variations I have aren't that far off, whether it's Watkins, whether it's Jackson, whether it's, I'm trying to remember who the other strikers I've had in there. I had a really, really good draft with Ndai from Sheffield United as my kind of cheap striker at 5.5. Thought that I'd have really good projections, and then he got transferred to Marseille. So that was kind of like a kick. And I'm still kind of watching the wire because I still think there's a chance that a player or two could move. There's talk about the young Italian kid from Leeds, Nanto, going to Everton. If a player like that goes to a place like Everton and he comes in at $5 million as a forward, that's an easy fodder. Drop him on the end of your bench. It'll take a little bit to get in the lineup, but a lot of excitement, a lot of energy here. We got another week. We'll be back next Thursday night. We'll be following the Premier League show next week. So before we let you go, please, as always, join the Premier League channel. Go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure and like, share, bring other folks in if you think they may like the content. Let us know what you liked about the show. If you didn't like something, send it to Matoush. He would love to read it. Comment on his clothes. He would love to know your opinion on the clothes and the attire as well, as it will be a theme for this upcoming season. But most importantly, we'll be back next Thursday night, 9 Eastern, 8 Central, ready to give you our close to final rosters, which will probably both get tweaked 2 or 3 times before Friday's deadline. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about any of the last-minute transfers that have come through, any outgoing players that have left, and any other fantasy news, injuries that occur that may affect your match week 1 lineups. So we can't tell you to make sure that your transfers work and your points go and take your hits right, because you don't have to. They're all unlimited, folks. You got a week. Keep tweaking with that team, and we will be back next Thursday night with another edition of the Fantasy Premier League Show. Thanks for watching. Thanks for paying attention, and everyone at American Scouser appreciates you. Have a great day.